So welcome to another 21st Century China Center UCSD Public Policy Talk. I am Victor Shi. I'm the Homey Alum Professor and the Director of the 21st Century China Center. Today, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Ken Wilcox, who's the author of this excellent book, The China Business Conundrum, which is on sale outside, and he's going to be available for signing after this event also. This is a truly interesting and insightful book about his experience trying to start a bank in the People's Republic of China. Ken, of course, was not a novice in banking when he tried to start a bank in China. Previous to that, he's had a 30-year-long career at the Silicon Valley Bank, rising up to the position of CEO of the bank prior to him going to China. But before that, he almost became one of us, an academic with a PhD in German. I'm sure German studies lost something very significant when you try to go to the dark side, so to speak, as we say. But fortunately for the banking world, he stayed in the banking sector. He went to China, tried to start a bank, and succeeded to some extent. We'll talk about how he succeeded, how he did not succeed. And he writes about his experience trying to start a bank in China in this book. So we're very happy to have him here. This event is being recorded, so it's going to be put online. Just be aware of that. And of course, in the 21st Century China Center, we always have a lot of events. So always check china.ucsd.edu for our upcoming events. So today we're just going to do Q&A format. I'm going to ask questions of Ken, and we can maybe begin here. So Ken, again, welcome to San Diego, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I guess my first question is, can you give us a little bit of background in how Silicon Valley Bank differ from a typical bank that we think of, that mainly grants small business loans or mortgages to customers? How is Silicon Valley Bank, or how was Silicon Valley Bank different in its business model?
Let me see. We're different in our business model in the following way. 99% of the companies that we worked with were either technology companies or venture capital funds. And venture capital funds are businesses, so they need to have a bank as well. So we are highly concentrated in that one area. The other 1% was wineries. And when we were still in existence, we banked more wineries than any bank in the country. So that's the main difference. And we were literally the only bank that focused on technology to the extent that we did.
No, but besides the sectoral, so typically, as you know, when banks make loans, there's some kind of collateral. In the case of mortgages, of course, the property that people would buy becomes the collateral. But for a startup, literally an entrepreneur just, has a great idea, decided to start a company. At least through the first few months to even a few years, there's really nothing except for a bunch of ideas, maybe gradually some intellectual property. On what basis would you make loans to companies like that?
You're sounding like a regulator.
Sorry, yeah, exactly. That's my dream job.
So I will describe to you very succinctly this business model because it is unique. And I will admit that the regulators never liked it. Although it was not our business model that caused our demise. It's something totally different, which I'm willing to explain if you ask. But suffice it to say, it was not our business model that got us into trouble. And in any case, we got into trouble several years after I retired. So I'm not to be held responsible.
Which we won't talk about. At least I won't talk. Yeah.
So the business model, though, was quite a bit different from that of any other bank. And let me explain it this way. If you've ever gotten a mortgage to buy a house, you know the way it works. The bank wants two sources of repayment. And what I'm saying is universal, by the way. It applies everywhere in the world, almost everywhere in the world. A bank won't lend money without two sources of repayment. The first source of repayment is supposed to be cash flow. And that's why when you get a mortgage, they look at your pay stub. They want to find out that you have cash flow, that you're earning money to pay down the mortgage. The second source of repayment is supposed to be rock solid. And it's supposed to be collateral that can be sold. The idea is the first source of repayment is always cash flow. That's usually about 95% certain, but we don't know with 100% certainty because you could lose your job or something could happen. So the second source, because banks can't lose money, the second source has to be rock solid, and that's supposed to be collateral that it can be sold, and that would be your house. So if you lose your job, you can't pay your mortgage, the bank wants your house and to sell it. So how does that relate to our bank? We were dealing, 80% of our companies were startups. The other 20% were mature technology companies. So I'm going to talk about the 80% for just a minute. As startups, they had neither cash flow nor saleable collateral, at least in the eyes of the regulators, because what we called cash flow wasn't really cash flow. It was the next equity infusion from venture capitalists. And regulators don't like that because they don't think that's the same as a pay stub. And they're not sure you can depend on it. And the second source of repayment was not rock solid collateral. It was intellectual property. And the regulators didn't like that either because who knows how to value collateral. So our solution to all of that, just so you know we weren't crazy, was that we had at least 50 or so people in our bank who specialized in one thing and one thing only, and that is knowing every single partner in every single venture capital fund in the geography in which we operated. And not just statistically, but personally. In other words, we used to say, we play poker with Sequoia. And what we meant by that was that we knew each partner individually. So what advantage is that? There's no way on earth that we bankers can understand technology well enough to predict whether or not it's going to be good technology. But we can know people well enough to predict whether or not they'll pay us back. And so we spent a huge amount of time knowing every single venture capitalist in the US. And the truth is, all venture capitalists, I hope there are none in the room that will be offended, but they're not all created equally, so to speak. Some are more honest than others. Some are smarter than others. And that is what kept us alive. There's one more thing I'd add to that, and that is for every single early stage company, which was 80% of the companies we worked with, we got warrants, which are a contract enabling us to buy stock at a very cheap price. And although we had losses, the warrants covered the losses. But the real point of the business model was the 20% that were mature companies, because that's how a bank can make money, is the 20% that were mature companies, publicly traded. So the only question that remains, in case you're thinking about it, is why did we spend so much time on the 80% when we really were after the 20%? It's because if we didn't catch them when they were babies and nurture them, there's a good chance they'd go to Wells Fargo or Bank of America or Citicorp, because those banks are so gigantic and have, so many services. So we felt we had to, and we enjoyed doing it. Catch them when they were little, nurture them, and then they'd stay with us when they got big.
Great. So here you were in Silicon Valley, you got to know all the important players. You have a sense of the startups, the potential, you know the ecosystem very well. Why go to China? What was it at the time in the 2010s, late 2000s, that got the conversation going to say, guess what? We have to go to a socialist country ruled by a communist party and do it there.
They are?
They are, right, yeah.
I wish you'd told me that before I went.
Okay.
And no, here's the issue. There's two answers to that question. One is, when I became CEO in 2001, and I was CEO for 10 years. When I became CEO in 2001, we'd already pretty much saturated the US market. We had dominant market share by an order of magnitude everywhere in the US. And we decided that if we wanted to continue to grow, we wanted to go to other countries. So we started with Israel, great business in Israel. Then we went to India, then we went to various European countries. And ultimately we decided to go to China. So that's one reason. The other reason is because technology is different from almost any other industry, and at least given the way we think about it, because it's inherently global. Meaning you can have a dairy industry that's just a United States dairy industry and be just fine. But technology is inherently global because you can't be cutting edge anywhere unless you're cutting edge everywhere. And that's because there is no wall tall enough to prevent technology from crossing borders. It could be that, China will get two years ahead of us in AI, and we'll be 2 years ahead of China in semiconductors, but that won't last long. You can't stay very far ahead of a competitor in any technology for very long, because every morning, all of the innovators around the world wake up and they try to advance the global knowledge base. And when they go to bed at night, they may have brought their portion of the global knowledge base, a couple of days or months or something ahead of everybody else's, but rest absolutely assured that the other innovation centers around the world will all catch up. And I do think that those of you who are familiar with semiconductors will acknowledge that NVIDIA chips show up in the darndest places.
Yeah, exactly. They're all over the world. Well, so also at that time, I can remember early 2010s, because I was in Wall Street, there was this buzz about Chinese technology, right? This was the first wave of IPOs, the JD's, Alibaba, and people made very serious money. So probably some of the VCs in your network were saying that, Ken, you've got to go to China because that's where the action is. I mean, how serious was the buzz in Silicon Valley?
Well, at the risk of sounding a little arrogant,
Yeah.
and I'm actually not that arrogant.
You were telling them.
Yeah. We talked the VCs into going to China, not the other way around.
Not the other way.
We started going to China in 2000, the year 2000. And after, I think, 3 years, maybe 4 years, in 2004, we saw so much going on in China, and we were so convinced that China was going to have explosive growth in the innovation sector, that we organized a trip for the best venture capitalists, mostly in California. And they paid their way. But we organized the whole trip. We showed them everything we'd seen in primarily Beijing and Shanghai at the time. And these were by far and away the best names in the group. And every one of them set up shop in China in the ensuing year or two, in 2005 or 2006. So I
You
think
started the buzz.
we started the buzz, and I think it was because we'd already been to, spent time in Israel and set up shop. We were in India and set up shop. We were in London and set up shop. And we just had developed a little bit of a sense of how to gauge whether or not a given innovation center was going to experience explosive growth. And in the case of China, we were absolutely convinced that this was gonna be enormous in the fullness of time.
Yeah, well, in terms of market cap, you guys were not wrong. I mean, a lot of these tech
Yeah.
companies, the market cap fulfill the potential. So here you were, the board decided to give you the opportunity to found a new bank, the joint venture bank with a Chinese bank in China, in Shanghai. You land and you start to try to set up. So let's say 3 months into after you moved full-time to China, what was the biggest surprise compared to your expectation prior to, going to China full-time, both positive and negative surprise?
Well, first of all, I want to correct one thing you said, because the way that worked was I was planning to retire at the end of 2010. I'd been CEO for 10 years. That's plenty. I was already old enough. And now I'm really old. And so it was all locked and loaded. We had a successor picked and everything was set to go. And I said to my wife in that final year, why don't we ask the board if they'd send us to India for a year or two? We can be elder statesmen and it'd be so fascinating. And then, as luck would have it, in the year 2010, two things happened simultaneously. One of them was the Indian regulators made it 1,000% clear that they were not going to give us a license. Don't ask me why. And the Chinese regulators sent a signal from Beijing that if we came to China, they would help us. They would pave the way for us. And so the board got together, they voted, they wanted to do it. And then they looked around and they couldn't find anybody who really wanted to go. People, they weren't anti-China, but they were all, tied up in their own things. They had spouses and children and I was the only one who was willing to go. And so it was an easy choice for them. But plus, age has its benefits in China. And I was clearly the oldest one around.
So after you land,
what
was the
surprise,
positive?
yeah.
Yeah, and maybe
Well,
a surprise. 3 months in, let's say 3 or 4 months. Yeah.
We probably have to go more than that.
Yeah.
But I would like to emphasize one thing, and that is that I went to China, both my wife and I went with open minds.
Yeah.
And with receptive hearts. And we were both the kinds of people who were absolutely convinced that if you treated others as you would like to be treated, they will respond in kind. And so that was our expectation in going to China. And then I decided to apply what I would call the scientific method, meaning I decided that every time I saw something that was different, I would write it down in a journal and I would keep track of all the differences. And I would write down in the journal potential explanations for the differences. It's almost like I was developing my theory of China. And you may wonder, that sounds probably a little hokey to you, but the truth is China is so different from what I had experienced in the US in a multiplicity of ways. It is more different than any other place that I have been for extended periods of time. And I've been in several countries, but it was so different that it was just baffling me. And I think what happens to all of us as human beings, I'm not gonna put the finger on Americans in particular, but just human beings. We grow up someplace and we develop these, what I call mental models of how things work. And we take them with us wherever we go and we superimpose them on where we go. And it helps us interpret what we see. Well, if you're going to the UK or to Germany as an American, your mental models will work most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time. If you're going to China, they won't necessarily apply. And to take a little bit of the mysticism out of that, let me give you one example. And that is, as an American, somebody who grew up in the United States and was in business in the United States for a long time, I have this idea that government is here. And by the way, we don't like government that much, so we try not to have much to do with it. Business is over here, and we like business and we have a lot to do with it. And party is something totally different. That has nothing to do with anything in particular.
Winery.
What?
I said winery.
Wineries.
Eric.
Oh, yeah, parties at wineries. Well, I'm talking about political parties. But when you get to China, at least for me, maybe you think I'm thick, but it took a long time before I figured out that party and government and business were all the same thing. And after about 6 or 8 months, I started wondering, when I talked to Mr. Fu from Fu Jianhua from the Shanghai Pudong Development Bank, he was my conversation partner because he was the president there. When I talked to him, after 6 or 8 months, I started thinking, I wonder if I got his banker hat on, or his party hat, or his government hat. And it took me a long time before I realized he wore all 3 hats simultaneously. And then it took me even longer to realize that he didn't even know he was wearing hats. They're all the same thing to him. He didn't differentiate, he didn't compartmentalize. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. That we tend to, and I'm not saying all of you, because I'm not accusing you of anything, I'm just saying that human beings tend to assume that where they're going operates the same way as where they came from. And some of us pick up on it faster than others. He's not in the room here, so I can go ahead and say it. My successor in China was there for as long, actually slightly longer than I was. I don't think he ever figured out that party and business are the same thing. He thought he was dealing with bankers. He did not realize he was dealing with the Chinese Communist Party. And his idea was, there's no reason for me to have relations with the Chinese Communist Party because that's over here. All I have to do is do business.
Well, so actually, I think your approach, eventually you did figure it out because your explanation of Guanxi in this book, I mean, I urge people to read it. I think it's the best that I've seen in either language, Chinese or English, because it really gets at the heart of it. So after a while, what was your understanding of what Guanxi really meant?
Well, I hope I get it right. Can I look at the book again?
Yeah. Well, no, just off the top of your head.
Off the top of my head.
Off the top of your head,
Well,
but I think you truly understand it.
Well, there are of course, there's thousands of concepts.
Yeah.
To come to grips with. There are 2 that are sort of fundamental that Americans will realize exist within a couple of weeks of their arrival. One of them is Guanxi, and the other one is Mianza, and face and Guanxi. And so we start to develop our own explanations for what they mean. But it takes, in my opinion, it takes several years actually before you kind of soak up everything surrounding those concepts. So I'll take a shot at it, and those who know more than I do maybe say, well, you still don't have it right, Ken, because it's complicated. But I'll give you an example, you asked about Guanxi, not, face. So
Yeah.
Guanxi,
Yeah.
I remember in my third year, I got an hour-long lecture from the head of the graduate school of management at Fudan University over lunch on Guanxi. And he was explaining why it's so much better than anything you have in the United States. Because this is the way that we can have good and safe and profitable relationships with each other. And you Americans you don't have that concept, so you can't possibly accomplish that. It's so much better to do business in China because we have this idea called Guanxi. And he said the way it works is we get to know people really well. And it's a little bit of a tit for tat scorecard. You know, I get together with Lei Guang and I bring him a bottle of wine. And a week later, we get together again and he brings me a gift. And then a month later, I bring him a gift. And we keep raising the ante. Some of those gifts get to be pretty expensive. And of course, you're in big danger of running afoul of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And my board's audit committee was watching me like a hawk. So I had to report every one of the gifts that I got. But over time, we begin to develop this bond. And the bond exists, in my opinion, on two different levels. One of them is we like each other. Lei and I are friends. And I feel an obligation to him and he feels an obligation to me. The other one is there's a certain element of protection in it too, because I've got the goods on him and he's got the goods on me. And we definitely have to have each other's backs because I could get him into big trouble and he could get me into big trouble if he wanted to. So it's a bond that is almost, ends up being inseparable. And that is the foundation of trust. Now, maybe that's not what you were.
No, but that is, well, I mean, the only thing you also say is, you get to know what the others really want. And you
Yes.
try to deliver it for them, just like they try to deliver what you really want to you. And then that is the basis of like a real relationship, as opposed to just having a lawyer sign a bunch of papers. And,
Right.
You know.
Yeah,
so on and
because
so
in China,
forth.
they typically don't have lawyers with contracts. I mean, they don't,
Wait, they do, but
They do.
that is just not the important part.
no, they throw the
deal,
contract
yeah.
in the wastebasket when you're not looking. And it's all the Guanxi. It's not
Although in the West,
contract.
there is a similar thing, it's called boarding schools, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Like hazy.
I never went to one though, so I was hopeless here.
Right,
Yeah.
okay, so this is great. Okay, so in the book, you also talk a lot about what you gradually learn about the Chinese Communist Party and
Yeah.
its role in the financial system. What were some key events that really made you realize the importance of the party? And also whether the party actually overtly intervened in the operation of the JB.
Yes. So let me start by saying, and this is all my opinion. If you have a different opinion, I respect it. I probably still believe in my own. But my opinion is that the Chinese Communist Party can control anything it wants to control. They are in a position to control anything they wish. Do they control everything? No, of course not, because not everything is important to them. If you're in China and you're carrying on a business and the Chinese Communist Party is not, and there's no evidence that they're attempting to control you, my guess is you're doing something they don't care about. That it must be, from their point of view, not strategic. And I'll give you a good example. At a conference a couple of years ago, we had a speaker who was very, very happy with his life in China. He was in his 40s. He graduated from some school in the United States that has a Chinese studies program, like University of Michigan. He was really interested He went to China almost immediately. He got a job, Shanghai, actually. He got a job. Soon he met a Chinese woman, fell in love. Soon they were producing children. And then when he was in his forties, he finally decided, I think I want to have a company. I want to make money. And so he put together a company, about 45 employees, and he was making money. He said hand over fist. Chinese Communist Party never bothered him, never took an interest. Well, what was your company? He said, I'm a spatulist. I'm making barbecue equipment, like spatulas and stuff like that.
Clamps.
Yeah, no. I said, well, that's great. But you're not doing something that they care about that much. But there's certain key industries, and they're fairly identifiable. The Chinese Communist Party definitely wants to play a role. One of the first things that I noticed was I had only been there a couple of months when my conversation partners at our joint venture partner, Shanghai Pudong Development Bank, started talking to us about how important it was to have a party committee. And I thought, that's weird. What is a party committee? We had at Silicon Valley Bank a party committee, but all they did was put on parties, like the Christmas party and that stuff. Well, I said, well, what is a party committee? And they said, I got different definitions depending on who I talked to. It was one of those kind of nebulous things that it seemed like nobody had a clear-cut definition. Some people said, well, it's a board behind the board. It's an anonymous board that's above the board, and they will really make the ultimate decisions, but you'll never meet them because they're all anonymous, but they'll work through the real board. And I couldn't figure that one out. Other people told me a party committee is a place that will meet, or a group that will meet once a month in your offices after work and study the writings of Xi Jinping and discuss them. And then other people said, no, a party committee is just what you said. It's like an activities committee. They'll collect money from everybody and they'll put on the Christmas or the spring
Festival.
spring festival party.
Yeah.
So, and then one day, this was early, this was maybe at 3 months, by the way, now that you mentioned it. I decided to take Mr. Swun to lunch. Mr. Swun was the guy at Shanghai Pudong Development Bank that was monitored all of their joint ventures. And Pufa had like 40 joint ventures going on.
Oh, wow.
And so I took Mr. Swun to lunch and he said to me, he said, I don't like your business model. I think it's too risky. And I'm going to see to it that you contain your risk. I said, well, how are you going to do that? And he said, well, I'm going to be on the party committee. And I said, what's the party committee? And he said, the party committee is a board, but it's an anonymous board. You'll never know who is on it, but we'll make the decisions. And well, how are you going to get them done? Well, we'll funnel them through because our board was 50%, 8 people on the board, 4 Americans, 4 Chinese. We'll funnel them through the 4 Chinese members and we'll end up running things. And I immediately called up Mr. Fu and said, Mr. Fu, I got to understand this. What's this all about? And Mr. Fu said, oh, don't listen to Mr. Swun. That's just silliness. He's making it all up. Ultimately, I don't know. I never knew for sure if I'd accomplished anything. But I got the impression that I warded off the party committee for the duration of my tenure, which was 4 years.
Well, the overt party, but the party group was required to form in the JV because it had enough people in it.
Yeah, it ultimately.
So the underground.
Yeah, well, they kept it underground until I left, and then they brought it up from underground and explained it. And this will sound ridiculous, but I put up such a fuss about it at the time, and I was naive enough to think that I could put up a fuss and get away with it.
But was your opposition on the grounds of like fiduciary duty, like you felt that if there was a rival decision maker in the bank, you wouldn't be serving.
I had
your
two issues.
shareholders?
Yeah. One of them was, and this will sound absolutely ridiculous, but I'm telling you, it's true. I said, well, you could only have a party committee if I get to have a Democratic committee and a Republican committee as well. And they just thought that that was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard. And that I had just proven that I was an idiot. And then, but the other thing was, how was I supposed to go back to our board in Santa Clara and say, you just invested $120 million, your half of the equity in this thing, and it's actually being run by an anonymous group of people who are communists. And you will never know who they are. How, was that gonna fly, or was I gonna look like I'd really screwed up?
You say, well, there's an auditing committee and, you know, except they audit everything, not just the books.
Yeah,
You know,
They
or
do.
something like that.
yeah, yeah. The other thing, though, that ultimately proved surprising to me was, in the course of the first maybe half year to a year, I met approximately 10 or 12 different people in Shanghai. Out of 25 million people, I met 10 or 12 that were all apparently part of what I call in my book the secret committee. But these were all people in key positions who always knew what we were doing and who always knew about a conversation I'd had with any one of the others in the weeks prior. And it was very clear to me as time went by that they were guiding us. In part, I benefited from the guidance because they helped remove obstacles. And in part, it was the other way around. They created obstacles because ultimately the goal, and here I'm getting to the actual punchline, if you don't mind.
But
Yeah, the goal was, and my theory is that most Western companies are subject to the same set of circumstances. The goal was to encourage us to come to China. And then tie us up in regulation that prevented us from actually doing business for a period of time. And observe us very carefully and try to extract whatever knowledge we had to offer. And then use that themselves. And then ultimately, by the time they untied us, so we were no longer being prevented from engaging in business to the extent that we intended to, they had taken that knowledge and created a competitor. And that competitor then would compete against us in China. And ultimately, in some cases, not in our case, but in some cases will then compete against the company in question globally, which would be true pretty much in the auto industry by way of example. But I would like to make that a little bit concrete so you understand what I'm saying, because it all sounds very vague, I think, the way I described it. And I'm going to do that by just pointing to 3 points in the evolution of our development in China. The first one would have been in 2010, before I'd even committed to go. And that was when we met, I and the chairman of our company met with a man named Yu Zhongsheng
oh, Shanghai.
a handful of times.
Yeah.
I think 4 times. He was the
Shanghai
party secretary of Shanghai. And when Xi Jinping came to power 2 years later, at the end of 2012, Yu Zhongsheng was taken out of Shanghai and elevated to the standing committee. So he was one of the 7 most powerful people in China, I guess, in a way.
Mhm.
So Yu Zhongsheng met with us, and this is what he said. And this is pretty much a quote, and I suspect you'll question my whether or not I'm telling you the truth because it sounds so ludicrous. But he said to me, he said, we have groups of people that do research, and our researchers have searched the world around. And we have identified your bank, Silicon Valley Bank, as the bank that we need in China. In order to help us develop our innovation space.
Yeah.
And then he said, this is where you're gonna doubt me. He said, your bank is more important than Goldman Sachs. And more important than Morgan Stanley. And then he said, this is true. He said, Ken, you are one of the smartest Americans ever.
You don't said that well.
Yeah, he
Definitely.
says, as you get China. And I want to assure you, I'm not as stupid as it sounds. Meaning, I realize he didn't mean it. But on the other hand, it did feel good. And it made me feel like we are on the route to accomplishing what we wanted to accomplish. So that's the first one. There's only two more. And then you'll understand the whole point.
Arc. Yeah.
The arc.
Arc.
I call it an arc.
Yes.
The second one is when we finally got the license, it was about a year after my wife and I arrived. And we finally got the license. Somebody from the government came to me and said, we are so happy. This is the best day that I can think of. We've got this license for you. We're so happy. I hope you're as happy as we are. And here's your license. And then they explained to me, not necessarily in that same meeting, but in the ensuing weeks, two things which kind of obviated the whole license. The first one was that in almost every other country that we've been to, when you get a banking license, your bank can do anything other banks with a license can do. But in China, that's not true. In China, a bank that like ours would require 15 to 20 different licenses. And they were going to dole those out when they felt like it. Over time, we never got all the licenses we needed, but the banking license that we got on day one entitled us to call ourselves a bank and to open the front door and say hi. But we couldn't even open a website. We needed a website license. We couldn't take a deposit. We needed a deposit taking license. We couldn't make a loan. We needed a loan giving license. There's about 15 different, 20 maybe licenses we needed. The other thing they told us, and you're gonna again think that I must be fairly stupid that I didn't know this before. But they told us that there was a law on the books that had been there for so long, it was impossible to change it. But a brand new bank with any foreign ownership could not use Chinese currency for the first 3 years. Now, first of all, laws in China are totally arbitrary and capricious. They make them up when they want them. That's number one. Number two is they could have gotten rid of it with the waving a wand if they felt like it. And number three is it's totally in violation of the spirit of the WTO, which they had joined in 2001. And there are still people I know who helped negotiate China's entry into the WTO who don't seem to appreciate that China wasn't really following the rules all those years. And so I immediately, when I found that out, because I'd been on the Federal Reserve Board in San Francisco for 7 years earlier, I went to my friends in San Francisco and I said, why do you let this happen? Why? You've given 4 Chinese banks licenses. Why don't you tell them they can't use dollars for the first 3 years? And the Federal Reserve, they're nice people. They said, you know, that's your problem, not ours. They said, our job is to ensure the safety and soundness of the financial system. We can't play favorites. So that was the second one. Now I just want to mention the third one, and then you'll see the arc. The third one was at the end of the 3 years when they came to me and they said, this is the happiest day for us because today we can grant you permission to use Chinese currency. And there's one other thing, we so admire your business model. We think it's an amazing business model. We've decided to start a bank of our own here in Shanghai. And I want you to meet with the management team to explain to them some of the things they didn't fully understand watching you for 3 years when you couldn't do business anyway. That's honestly true. They actually did. How do you go home and explain that to your board without looking like a complete buffoon?
But can't that happen to any JVs then?
Huh?
Can that happen to any JVs, international JVs especially?
It can, yeah.
Yeah, because like if
Of
you
course.
work with another bank in Israel, they can spin off and do their own thing.
Oh, they can. But I don't think it's quite so premeditated
Yeah,
and so well organized. And it's I'll tell you what I felt like. So I hope that those of you with Chinese understanding of Chinese culture will recognize this. In China, as I understand it anyway, there's a belief that men avoid wearing green hats. Because if you wear a green hat, it's an indication that you've been cuckolded, which means that your wife has been having affairs. And I began to believe that I had earned the Green Hat Award because I felt that I'd been led down the path so many times and fooled so egregiously that it was an embarrassment to admit it. And one of the things you might notice if you research this a little bit is that there have been tons of books written about China in these past several years. Very few up until this last year. Somehow it seems like everything I do time I do something that I consider novel, it turns out I'm just in the middle of the pack. But up until this last year, there have been very few books written by business people. In the last year, there have been a number that have come out, including mine, by business people. Why didn't business people write books before? In my opinion, this is my theory. There are two reasons. One is it's too embarrassing. And the other one is that they did fear and do fear, I think, retribution on the part of the party, because the party gets even with people who are critical of it.
well, on that note, we'll open up to audience Q&A. Any questions? Yeah, over there.
Yeah, so thank you, Ken, for that, sharing your experiences. I want you to, use your imagination. Use your imagination, and I want to understand from your perspective, what is you think the relative strength of Chinese guanxi is? And if you knew then what you knew now, would developing better guanxi at different stages of your development led to a different outcome? Or was it just structurally impossible for an American bank to go over there and then eventually not be replaced by a competitor that learned all of the know-how?
Well, I'm gonna give you about 3 different answers to that question, okay? The first one would be, I would never shy away from building guanxi. I think it's always a good idea.
I thought that was the entire idea that the SVB is built to develop this relationship. with
Yeah.
Venture capital partner.
There are people in China that I consider, I believe what they're telling me, who say we did a great job of developing guanxi. And we should be happy about it. So I'm not sure I would never discourage building it, as long as you don't compromise yourself by accepting gifts that are too large or giving people gifts that are too large. But so I wouldn't say that. I think ultimately, any company is vulnerable to the arc that I described,
Regardless of which.
regardless of guanxi. Yeah, but I would say that there are things that American companies can do better. And the main thing I would point to is this. I'm sure that many of you will recognize what I'm talking about. I believe that many, if not most people in my age bracket, if they were working in a professional organization, were asked to take a seminar in negotiation at some point. I think I know tons of people in my age bracket that took negotiation seminars. Every one of them was based on Getting to Yes, which is a book that was produced by the Harvard Negotiation Project decades ago. And Getting to Yes is all about, Leigh, I'll just pick on you because you're sitting there. Leigh and I are negotiating. We're on each other's side. I want to find out what his needs are and satisfy them. He wants to find out what my needs are and satisfy them. We're trying to craft a deal that works for both of us. The Chinese Communist Party has not read that book. And in China, negotiation, in my estimation, is all about leverage. It's like, I have to figure out what my leverage is. And I have to figure out what Leigh's leverage is. And if my leverage is greater than Leigh's, I have an obligation to myself to win.
Use the leverage.
And if his is greater, I have to expect that he's going to win and I have to live with it. And I think we need to do a better job of understanding. We can leave the book Getting to Yes at home because it's not gonna help. And I think we need to understand the Chinese Communist Party's approach to negotiation. We have to learn what our leverage is, and we have to try harder to make it greater and to extend it longer. And I'm not telling you I know exactly how to do that.
So do you think it's a misperception when advisors tell American companies that they should focus on Guanxi in China, when in the end?
No, no, I think it's always good, but I don't think it's the,
Only.
it's the deciding factor.
Yeah.
Leverage is the deciding factor.
Leverage.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
Let's go next question. Yeah, Leigh, go ahead. Yeah.
So can Mr. Fu wears 3 hats, but there is still kind of a functional division of labor. You know, he was primarily a banker while a party
Yeah.
member put in charge of that. But when you were there, you must have to deal with the government officials as well, right? People in the government.
Yeah.
In the party. How do they behave differently to you than Mr. Fu? For example, right? When you meet them as the government official or as the party secretary.
Yeah, that's a very good question. The other thing that we have to factor in when we try to answer a question like that is, are there differences in personality? And there definitely are differences in personality. That said, I believe that most party members feel an obligation to come up with answers to situations and questions that are within the scope of the playbook. In other words, they don't have the latitude to come up with exceptions. They have to follow the playbook pretty much. And it was of utmost importance that I develop relationships with people in government and in the party. They still didn't have a huge amount of latitude, I don't think, but they were more likely to help us to the extent that they reasonably could without deviating from the playbook. If they thought that that I was trying. And I do think I got some credit for trying. On the other hand, you can try too hard too. Meaning, when I found out that we weren't going to be able to use Chinese currency for 3 years, I just accepted the consequence and assigned all of the banking activities to somebody else because there were virtually none. And then I set about trying to get an exception. And I literally drew myself a map of all of the institutions that could affect us. And I came up with 3 different possibilities for getting an exception. I mapped them out and I pursued all of them. And to a certain extent, I was successful in the sense that I got a message to the top. But I wasn't successful in that I never got an exception. And in the 3rd year of this waiting period, I was advised strongly by several people to cut it out. They said, you're trying too hard, you're starting to piss people off. And just let it go.
Do we have any online questions?
Yeah,
Okay.
one question from online was asking you to talk a little bit more about what you meant by leverage, where you felt you had it and how you were able to successfully apply it, and the converse.
Yeah, what was your leverage? Shane?
All right, so I had 2 different kinds of leverage that I could easily identify. One of them was their belief that I was in possession of a secret, which if they had, I would help them do what we did.
Successfully.
Yeah. And the other one was our half of the money, because we didn't put our half of the money in until after a year after we got, or in other words, when we got the license. But I did find out that once we put our money in, the leverage seemed to go away overnight. There were 2 things that made the leverage disappear. One was putting our money in. And the other one was when they found out the truth. And this is what I mean by that. Somewhere around the time we put the money in, Mr. Fu came to me one day, and it was unusual because I always had to come to him. And he came to me and I thought, this is weird, something's going on. And he looked really upset. And he said, I'm very disappointed in you because you have deceived me. And I said, what on earth are you talking about? And Mr. Fu said, you have an algorithm that enables you to differentiate between early stage technology companies that are going to succeed and those that won't. And you haven't disclosed the algorithm. And I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. And I think where he got that idea is, you may or may not know that Wells Fargo has for a long time had an algorithm that they use in small business lending. And it's so that you don't have to train account officers that much. They can plug a bunch of stuff into a program and press a button. It'll tell them whether to make a loan to the dry cleaners or not. But this is a dry cleaners. It's not a technology company. We never had an algorithm. Ours is based on what I call pattern recognition, meaning we make people spend years meeting companies and discussing with each other what made the company succeed and what prevented it from succeeding. And so our lenders went through an extended apprenticeship. And it's all about pattern recognition. And when I told Mr. Fu that day, he wouldn't believe me. He thought I was prevaricating. And so then I did, of course, exactly what I should not do. But I said, we'll prove it to you. So we'll put on an all-day seminar for our cemetery, his seminar, for all of your top people explaining how our business model does work. And we even got Gary Rochelle to come in and speak too, and verifying. Gary Rochelle is one of the leading venture capitalists in Shanghai at the time, explaining how our business model worked. And I think that I lost a lot of leverage there, because before that I had an algorithm that I wasn't. I should have just kept that algorithm and not told them.
Were you ever tempted to say, come here, I'll tell you the secret, privatize your bank? They would have loved that one. Well, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us about the book.